It reflects as well in the SG's recent publication, Our Common Agenda, where it defines a number of public goods, of critical global commons, including protecting the climate and the environment. And if you take the architecture of the United Nations and how we reached to this today's conclusion that this is a common good, that this is something we need to care for, it is truly amazing, but it's truly worrying as well, because, as I said, it's a human-made trio of emergencies. The connected nature of this triple challenge is absolutely real. These disasters reinforce each other. The more climate changes, the more we lose biodiversity. The more we lose biodiversity, the more we risk climate change, land degradation, air and water pollution. And definitely we need to look at these three crises and address them together to maximize the benefits of getting out of the crisis and minimize the trade-offs. This being said, there's hope, and I think that's also what transpires in the presentation we just received. There's a hope because there's a wide agreement nowadays in capitals, in the financial world, that action needs to be taken. And action needs to be taken with the speed and the necessity that COVID-19 is putting on us. COVID-19 has halted a number of economies, has given us the possibility to invest again, and therefore to accelerate action on the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the critical agendas of biodiversity and pollution. There's research which is done, and it shows that if we invest correctly the money that the COVID-19 recovery is bringing in the economies, we could knock off about 25% of the emissions by 2030. But to do this, we must find the most effective stimulus policies that create recovery through decarbonization, through baking nature, and through tackling pollution. Never in humanity, or at least in my lifetime, have I seen government ready to invest so much money at once in the economy. And we know this is not a chance that will come back. So we are creating a financial burden for the next generations, and it can't come on top of a climate, environmental, and pollution burden, because that would be just incredibly wrong. If we don't seize the chance that we have with the incredible spending policy that our governments have proposed post-COVID to really transform our economies and to reach through that a real transformation of our societies, we will never get it again. So.
However, in the last years, perhaps I could identify that the major turning point, philosophically speaking and in legal terms speaking, is that there has been an increasing acknowledgement of the intrinsic relationship between environment and human rights. That is the acknowledgement that you cannot protect the right to life, you cannot protect human rights and dignity without the protection of the environment. The right to life not only imposes a duty to refrain from killing, but also a duty to actually foster life. And the lack of action to prevent, if you want, this type of harm, environmental harm, affects obviously potentially puts at risk the right to life of all this population. But there is this duty of the states to actually take positive action to foster life. We have just seen recently that the Human Rights Council has acknowledged, because of the voting of the majority of the states, the right to a healthy environment as such, as a self-standing right, is being acknowledged and accepted. And I think that the step is extremely important, because the consciousness of humanity is actually gaining awareness and pushing for these acknowledgements and for these developments. I guess this leaves us with, the need for those who are most responsible to actually take action, because it's not the same that a small state, decides to actually take specific steps than if a major state and also the private sector commits to take steps that are needed. What we are, at a crucial moment in time, and there is no time to continue debating and discussing. What is the time for action? And I believe that if we don't want to see the destruction of humanity and the environment together, this action has to take place. Final moment where different areas of law have to be harmonized, and particularly that's the task for not for the legislators, since the law is already there, but for the judges. And we are seeing already a few investment claims in that context, where different obligations and rights are to be properly read. On the one hand,
when it comes to public work, here is where we can do a lot of difference. Through showing our advocacy, through engaging in campaigns and meetings on the ground that can sway, where possible, both the public opinion and the calculus of decision makers, who often, because ultimately we care and we put ourselves all into it. And thus we are making sure that when we invest our own efforts in climate action, when we invest our expertise, our commitment, our passion, we're able to take time to replenish them too. Because no engagement post COP26 will be efficient and will achieve the results we want if we are ourselves not ready for that. To see a good COP27 after whatever COP26 is going to bring to us, it is of paramount importance that we are out there for each other, to commend each other for the efforts that we have been doing, to stop infighting within the youth climate movement, to assure a unity of purpose in what we are doing, and
of how the pledges have moved over the last 5 years since Paris. So the black line is the way that emissions have increased since 1990. And from the initial NDCs published about 5 years ago, emissions were still going to rise into the future. But looking at all the pledges published up to the end of July this year, we're now into the range that emissions would stabilize roughly. Global emissions would stabilize from these pledges. So there has been movement in terms of the ambition that has been pledged. But if you compare that with a slide I showed you 2 slides back, which showing the required 45% reduction in emissions by 2030, you can see that the gap is very large. The pledges are absolutely not on track to get us to where we need to be for 1.5 or even 2 degrees warming. We're more on a track for about 2.7 degrees, I think, if you follow these pledges through. This is really technical stuff, but the Paris rulebook is not yet completed, and it will be important that there is further work on getting the rules finished on how you share emission commitments between countries, because that will be a key to making some of these financial flows actually happen. Well, I've probably, what am I optimistic about it? Well, maybe the glass is 1/3 full and 2/3 empty in terms of the emission commitments at the moment. We are starting to make progress, and there are lots of good enablers like the falling costs of some technologies that we've seen. Climate laws and institutions are expanding in lots of countries, and I think that's a sign of optimism. But one of the issues that has come up in IPCC discussions with governments is at what point people become liable for the damage that they might have caused. If they did not know they were causing damage at the time, they might argue that they are not then liable for it. And there's then this question about when people actually knew about the human impacts of climate change. And conventionally, it's probably 1990 with the start of the Climate Convention. And it's one of the reasons we often have debates even about when our graphs should start. Should they start in 1850? Should they start in 1970? Or should they start in 1990? And the debates are underpinned by that question of liability. The first of all thing to say is renewable energy is not an expensive form of energy compared with fossil fuels now. There have been dramatic drops in the cost of solar energy and wind energy that means that they are actually coming in at lower costs than the cost, say, of a new gas-fired or coal-fired power station. And it's been an extraordinary change that's just taken place over the last decade or so. And again, if you were looking, especially with solar cells, because they can be very distributed, it means that you can get solar cells in without having a fixed electricity grid to do it. You can electrify specific villages and communities without having a big electricity grid in place. So I think there's lots of positive stories there. It could actually be an advantage rather than a disadvantage to move to renewable energy.